Why did the horse breaker say you'll ride like a stallion to this Eastern beginner? What came next? CowBoy Secrets. You'll ride like a stallion by the end of summer, he said, and the way he looked at me when he said it, like he already knew something about me that I hadn't figured out yet, made my whole chest go quiet. I didn't know then that those words would change everything. I didn't know that a summer in Wyoming, on a ranch I'd never heard of, working alongside a man I'd never met, would become the most important season of my entire life. I didn't know that a horse, a fence, a thunderstorm, and one long, burning silence could rearrange the entire architecture of who you thought you were. But that's exactly what happened. And I think about it still, every single day. My name is Eli Carter. I'm 22 years old. I grew up in Philadelphia, and until the summer I turned that age, the closest I had ever been to a horse was a carousel at the county fair when I was 7. I'm a city kid in every real sense of that phrase. I grew up between row houses and corner stores, concrete sidewalks and subway grates, the smell of exhaust and soft pretzels, and the particular kind of heat that radiates off pavement in July like the earth itself is exhausted. I went to a decent college, studied environmental science because I genuinely cared about land and conservation and the way humans relate to the natural world, even if I'd never actually lived inside that natural world. I was, in the most honest terms possible, a person who loved nature in theory and had very limited experience with it in practice. The internship was my professor's idea. Dr. Fern Alcott, a woman in her late 50s who had spent decades studying sustainable land management across the American West, pulled me aside after class one afternoon in April and told me she had a contact at a working cattle ranch in central Wyoming. The ranch was family-owned, multi-generational, and had recently started a partnership with her university's environmental science program. They needed a summer intern to help document land use patterns, water management, and native grassland restoration efforts. It was unpaid, but room and board were included. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "You're the most theoretically capable student I've had in years, Eli. But theory without contact with the real thing is just a very pretty map of somewhere you've never been." I said yes before I fully understood what I was agreeing to. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Casper, Wyoming with 2 duffel bags, a field notebook, a brand new pair of boots I'd bought at an outdoor supply store in Center City that were already giving me a blister just from wearing them around my apartment, and approximately zero practical knowledge of anything that was about to be required of me. The drive from Casper to the Whitmore Ranch took nearly 2 hours. The ranch's owner, a woman named Margaret Whitmore, had arranged for someone to pick me up from the airport. That someone was a man in his late 50s named Dale, who wore a hat the color of old saddle leather and said maybe 40 words to me across the entire drive. He wasn't unfriendly. He just wasn't particularly interested in conversation, and I respected that, so I spent the drive looking out the window at a landscape that genuinely stunned me into silence. Wyoming is not like anything I had ever seen. I want to be very clear about that. It is not picturesque in the way that a park is picturesque, carefully curated and softly lit. It is enormous in a way that is almost uncomfortable, in a way that makes you feel, if you're being honest, a little bit afraid. The sky sits so low and so wide that it feels less like something above you and more like something around you. The land rolls in long, slow waves of brown and gold and pale green, interrupted by the dark shapes of distant ridgelines and the occasional white flash of a creek catching the afternoon light. There are no buildings. For miles and miles, there are simply no buildings, no signs, no lights. Just the land and the sky and the wind, which I would learn is essentially the third resident of every ranch in Wyoming, always present, always with something to say. I felt something shift inside me as we turned off the paved road onto a gravel lane lined with old fence posts, and I saw far ahead the shapes of a ranch coming into view, barns and outbuildings, and a long, low house with a covered porch backed by a ridge of pale hills. It was beautiful. Honestly, genuinely beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with something older and more serious than that. I also felt underneath the beauty the very clear and distinct sensation of being completely, profoundly out of my depth. Margaret Whitmore met me on the porch. She was a compact, weathered woman in her late 60s with sharp blue eyes and a handshake that meant business. She welcomed me warmly but efficiently, showed me the small room I'd be staying in off the main house, gave me a brief orientation about meal times and ranch schedule, handed me a laminated sheet of ranch rules, and told me I'd start with Dr. Alcott's documentation project in the morning, but that I should also expect to help with general ranch operations as needed. "We're a working ranch," she said, "not a resort. Everyone here pulls weight." "Absolutely," I said. "Good," she looked at my boots. "Those'll fall apart in a week. Dale can drive you into town for proper ones Saturday." She was right, they lasted 4 days. That first evening, I ate dinner at the long wooden table in the ranch kitchen with Margaret, Dale, and two ranch hands named Roy and Tomas, who were both in their late 40s and mostly talked to each other about fencing supplies and a section of the north pasture that was flooding badly. It was friendly in the low-key, no-ceremony way of people who share a table regularly and don't feel the need to perform warmth they don't actually feel. I was offered food, asked a few polite questions about Philadelphia and my program, and otherwise allowed to simply exist in the room without too much examination, which I was grateful for. The one person who wasn't at dinner was the person I would come to know best. Margaret mentioned him in passing when Roy asked about the new quarter horse that had come in from a ranch north of Laramie. "Cade's working with her tonight," Margaret said, in the tone of someone explaining why a chair is empty at a table, straightforward, no elaboration required. Roy nodded like that was exactly the answer he expected, and the conversation moved on. I didn't ask who Cade was, I figured I'd find out. I found out the next morning at 5:45 when I came around the corner of the main barn in the thin, cold, blue-gray light before sunrise, trying to locate the outdoor spigot Margaret had told me to use to fill the water troughs as part of my first morning's tasks, and nearly walked directly into him. He was standing at the fence of the round pen, a circular enclosure of wooden rails about 60 feet across, with one boot up on the lower rail and both arms resting on the top, completely still, watching the horse inside the pen. He was tall, maybe an inch or two over 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it escaped from under the brim of a worn gray hat. He was wearing a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans that had clearly been worked in for a very long time, and boots that were the same color as the earth. He looked like he had grown here, like he was part of the landscape in the same way the fence posts and the distant ridgeline were part of it, entirely natural and entirely unaware of being observed. The horse in the pen was a dark bay mare, maybe 15 hands, with a white star on her forehead, and the particular quality of alertness that I would later learn meant she was still in the early stages of being started under saddle. She was moving in slow circles around the pen, not frantically but with a coiled, watchful energy. Every few seconds she would flick her ears toward the man at the fence and then away again, as if she was trying to decide whether he was worth paying attention to. He wasn't doing anything, he was just standing there, and somehow that was working. I stopped walking when I saw him because the scene was so quietly absorbing that interrupting it felt wrong. I stood maybe 20 feet away and watched without meaning to for longer than I intended to. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. The air smelled of grass and manure and cold stone, and somewhere in the distance a single bird was making a sound I didn't recognize. The man at the fence didn't move. The horse kept circling. The light kept changing. It was one of those moments that arrives without announcement and stays with you forever, and I knew it even as I was standing in it, which is a rare and slightly unsteady feeling. Then the horse stopped circling. She turned and faced him directly, and after a long moment of stillness, she walked toward him slowly, with her ears up and her neck stretched forward, and pressed her nose against the fence rail near his hand. He let out a breath, quiet, controlled, like he'd been holding it without knowing. He reached out and placed one hand on the horse's nose with the kind of gentleness that people usually reserve for things that are much more fragile than they look. I must have made a sound. A small one, maybe just the shift of my weight on the gravel, but he turned immediately, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the length of the pre-dawn yard. His eyes were dark brown, the kind of brown that looks almost black in low light, and he had the resting expression of someone who was very comfortable not saying anything. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't warm. He was simply present, and the effect of it was oddly powerful, like standing near something with a strong gravitational field. "You the intern," he said. "Yeah," I said, Eli Carter." He looked at me for another second. Then he looked at my boots, the outdoor supply store boots that would not in fact survive the week. Something crossed his face that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't contempt. It was something more like the quiet, private recognition of a problem that he already knew the solution to. "Cade Whitmore," he said. I filed that away. Whitmore, Margaret's son then, or her grandson. I wasn't sure of the family structure yet. I would learn later that he was her grandson, that his parents had both died in a car accident when he was 11, and that he had grown up on this ranch in the fullest possible sense of that phrase, shaped by it, formed by it, as completely as the hills in the distance had been formed by whatever ancient geological pressure had pushed them up from the earth. "You watching the mare," I said, because I needed to say something. "Working with her," he said, "there's a difference." "Right," I said, "what's the difference?" He considered this, not like it was a dumb question but like it was a question that deserved a real answer. Watching is passive, working is a conversation you're communicating just on her terms, not yours. I looked at the horse who was still standing at the fence with her nose near his hand. She seems to trust you. Not yet, he said. She's curious. Trust takes longer. He said it without self-importance, just as a fact, and then he turned back to the horse, and I understood that was the end of the introduction. I found the spigot. I filled the troughs. But for the rest of that morning, while I walked the north pasture with my field notebook and tried to identify grass species I'd only ever seen in textbooks, I kept thinking about what he'd said. Trust takes longer. The first week at the Whitmore Ranch was, in the simplest terms, physically overwhelming. I had not understood before arriving what the body is actually required to do in a working agricultural environment. I had thought, in my earnest, theoretical way, that it would be tiring but manageable, that I would be sore for a few days and then adapt. What actually happened was that I was sore in places I hadn't known had muscles, that the days began before 5 in the morning and didn't end until after 8 at night, and that the gap between what I knew intellectually and what I could actually do with my hands and body was so vast that it was occasionally humiliating. I documented grasses badly at first, confusing species I should have recognized from coursework, missing the water table indicators Dr. Alcott had told me to watch for, writing notes that were thorough in the wrong ways. Roy, who was patient in the impersonal way of someone who has trained many interns and expects the learning curve, corrected me without cruelty. Tomas, who had more of a sense of humor, once watched me try to identify a sedge for 10 minutes before saying quietly, "That's a weed, city boy," and then walking away. I made mistakes with fencing and water systems and feed calculations. I learned, slowly and through failure, how to do each of these things. Margaret watched my progress with the expression of someone who has cultivated patience as a professional tool and is content to let the process unfold without accelerating it. And then there was Cade. My work and his didn't overlap often in that first week. He was primarily occupied with the horses. The Whitmore Ranch ran a small but respected operation breaking and starting young horses, primarily for other ranchers across the region, and that summer he had 6 young horses in various stages of the starting process. He was not part of the cattle operation or the land management work, and so our paths crossed mainly at mealtimes and occasionally in the early mornings when I was starting my day and he was already deep into his. But I noticed him. I noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't make noise but still somehow takes up a lot of space in a room. He was quiet, genuinely, constitutionally quiet, not shy or withholding, just economical with words in a way that suggested he had simply never developed the habit of filling silence for its own sake. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. When he didn't, he was still completely present, watching, thinking, absorbing. It was a quality I found myself responding to in a way I couldn't immediately categorize. I just knew that when he was in a room, something in me became more alert. On Thursday of that first week, he found me in the barn trying to fix a broken latch on one of the stall doors. I had been working on it for 20 minutes. It was not going well. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, just long enough for me to become aware of him, and then walked over, looked at what I was doing, and without saying anything, gently moved my hands away from the latch, picked up the screwdriver I'd been using, and fixed the problem in about 40 seconds. It involved a technique of angling the screwdriver that I hadn't known about and probably wouldn't have figured out. "Thanks," I said. "Old hardware," he said. "You have to approach it differently." He handed me the screwdriver, looked at the latch once to confirm it was sitting right, and started to walk away. Then he stopped and turned back. "You're going to be here all summer." "Yeah," I said, "until August." He nodded slowly like he was filing this away. "You want to learn to ride?" I hadn't expected that. "I don't know how." "That's why I asked if you want to learn," he said, with a tone so dry it took me half a second to catch it. There was no smile on his face, but there was something in his eyes, the faintest suggestion of one. "Yeah," I said, "I do." "Saturday morning," he said, "before breakfast, round pen." And he walked away. Saturday came with the particular quality of Wyoming summer mornings that I was beginning to understand, cool and brilliant and enormous. The sky already cycling from gray to pale gold to a blue so deep and clear it felt almost artificial, the air carrying the smell of sage and horse and cut grass and distance. I was at the round pen at 5:15, which was 15 minutes before Cade had said to be there, because I didn't want to start my first lesson late. He was already there. Of course he was. He was standing with a brown and white paint horse on a lead rope, a smaller, stockier animal than the bay mare, with kind, attentive eyes and a relaxed posture that communicated something like settled good nature. He looked up when I came through the gate and handed me the lead rope without preamble. "This is River," he said. "He's 8, he's been doing this a long time, he'll take care of you." "Hi River," I said somewhat stupidly to the horse. "That's fine," Cade said, and I had the impression he meant it sincerely. Talk to him, he doesn't understand the words but he reads the tone. What followed was 3 hours of the most concentrated instruction I had ever received in anything. Cade was a teacher the way very skilled practitioners are teachers, not by explaining theory, but by showing you the reality of something in small, precise increments, and then standing back and watching you engage with that reality, correcting when necessary, waiting when not. He taught me how to approach a horse properly, how to handle the lead rope, how to brush and check hooves and communicate basic respect through body language before anyone even thought about a saddle. We didn't get to the saddle that first morning, that was fine by the time we were done. I was tired in a pleasant way and had the particular satisfaction of someone who has learned several genuinely new things. And I had, over the course of those 3 hours, more sustained conversation with Cade Whitmore than in the entire preceding week. He was different when he was teaching. Not more talkative exactly, he was still economical with words but more available. The focused attention he usually directed inward turned outward, toward me and River, and there was something in that quality of attention that was profoundly engaging. He noticed things I didn't think were noticeable: the angle of my shoulder, the way I held my breath when I was nervous, the micro-hesitations in my handling of the lead rope that told him something about my confidence level. He called these things out without judgment, just as information. "Your grip is too tight, loosen it." He can feel tension in the rope the way you can feel it in a handshake. And he was right, and when I did what he said, the horse responded. Near the end of the lesson, when we were walking River in a slow circle around the pen, Cade said something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. "You've got good instincts," he said. "You're not trusting them yet, but they're there." "How can you tell?" I asked. "The way you responded when he spooked." Earlier in the lesson, a bird had flown up suddenly from the fence rail and River had startled and pulled sideways. I had not panicked. I had held the rope, gone with the motion, and waited for the horse to resettle. I hadn't known that was the right thing to do, I'd just done it. "I didn't think about it," I said. "That's what instinct is," he said. He said it simply, without drama, but the way he looked at me when he said it, assessing, a little surprised, with something underneath that I couldn't name, made something shift in my chest. Not dramatically. Just a small, precise movement, like something turning over once and settling into a new position. "You'll ride like a stallion by the end of summer," he said. And there it was, those words, the ones that would keep living in me long after the summer was over. The lessons became a routine. Every Saturday morning, 5:15 round pen. And then, because the lessons were going well and because Cade had apparently decided I was worth investing additional time in, they expanded: a Tuesday evening session, then a Thursday morning before my land documentation work, then occasional impromptu lessons when the timing aligned and he had a few spare hours. I progressed faster than either of us expected. The horse sensed that he had identified from the beginning, the instinctive body-level understanding that some people have for animals and some people simply don't, turned out to be something I possessed in a real way. Within 3 weeks I was trotting. Within 5 I was cantering. Within 6 I was riding alone around the ranch's large outdoor arena while Cade sat on the fence and watched with an expression of focused evaluation that, I was beginning to realize, had its own particular effect on me every single time. Because something was happening. Something quiet and gradual and enormously significant, in the way that large geological things happen, slowly, underground, invisible on the surface, until suddenly the landscape is entirely different and you realize it must have been changing for a very long time before you noticed. I was falling for him. I want to be honest about when I recognized this, because the recognition itself is part of the story. I didn't understand it immediately. I'm not sure I had the framework to understand it immediately. I grew up in a family that was loving and progressive in most ways, but the particular question of who I was emotionally and romantically was something I had avoided with considerable skill and thoroughness for my entire adult life. I had dated a girl in college, briefly, kindly, unsuccessfully, and had concluded mostly that I wasn't very interested in relationships rather than interrogating why. I was good at compartmentalization. I was good at channeling emotional energy into academic work and surface-level friendships and the particular busyness of a full life. What I was not good at, it turned out, was being around Cade Whitmore for 6 weeks and pretending that what I felt every time he looked at me or spoke to me or stood close enough for me to feel the warmth off him was just friendship. The moment I finally acknowledged it to myself was a Tuesday evening in late June, 3 weeks into the lessons. We had ridden out together on the ranch, me on River, him on a big gray gelding named Frank, across the south pasture and up into the foothills, following a fence line that needed inspection. It was the first time we had ridden together outside the arena, and the experience of moving through open Wyoming landscape on horseback, with the late afternoon light turning everything amber and the wind moving through the long grass and the horses' footfalls making a soft, rhythmic sound on the earth, was so overwhelmingly beautiful that I lost the thread of the conversation we'd been having about the fence line and simply went quiet. Cade noticed. He glanced at me. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, "it's just this is incredible." He looked out at the landscape. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but a softening, a recognition. "Gets me too," he said quietly, "every time." We rode on in silence, and it was the most companionable silence I had ever been part of, and I was looking at the profile of his face against the sky. The line of his jaw, the way his hat sat slightly back on his head, the particular set of his shoulders, and something in my chest cracked open the way the earth cracks open in spring, and I thought with sudden, perfect clarity, "Oh, this is what this is." And then I thought, oh no. The thing about falling for someone in a closed environment, a ranch in the middle of Wyoming where there are exactly 6 people living and working together across several thousand acres, is that there is nowhere to put it. There is no distance to retreat into, no city to lose yourself in, no casual social landscape of parties and coffee shops and friend groups where you can dilute your feelings with motion and distraction. There is just the land and the work and the people, every single day, unavoidable as weather. I went to work on being very careful. I was good at my documentation work. I threw myself into it with new intensity, taking longer field walks, writing more thorough notes, staying up late to compile data in a way that was probably excessive, but kept my mind engaged and directed. During meal times, I was friendly and conversational with everyone, made Margaret laugh a few times, learned the personal histories of Roy and Tomas through the gradual accumulation of stories shared over dinner. I was, in short, a model ranch intern and a very pleasant person to be around. And with Cade, I maintained the exactly same level of easy, uncomplicated camaraderie that we had been building. We continued the lessons. We continued the occasional quiet conversations that bookended them. About horses, about land, about the ranch's history, about my documentation work, about Wyoming and Philadelphia, and the ways they were different. I listened when he talked about the horses with the particular reverence of someone who has found their calling and knows it. He listened when I talked about grassland restoration with what seemed like genuine interest, asking questions that revealed he'd thought more about conservation and land health than I would have assumed. It was easy, that was the terrible part. It was so easy to be with him that the effort of not telling him the truth about what I felt had a quality like trying not to breathe, manageable in short increments, increasingly exhausting over time. I told no one. There was no one to tell. The first real crack appeared on a Friday evening in early July. A group of people from a neighboring ranch, the Havorson operation, about 12 miles east, came over for what Margaret called a neighbor gathering, which was apparently a regular summer occurrence. People from nearby ranches coming together for food and conversation, because the distances between ranches made casual socializing impractical most of the time. There were maybe 15 people in total, spread between the Whitmore kitchen and the porch, and the evening had the pleasant, loud quality of adults who genuinely like each other and don't see each other enough. Among the people from the Havorson Ranch was a man named Jensen Havorson who was 25, blonde, broadly built, and so thoroughly at ease in the social world of ranching that he had a kind of easy, physical confidence that I found mildly intimidating. He knew Cade well. They had grown up going to the same small school. Their grandmothers had been friends for decades, and there was clearly a long-standing comfort between them that expressed itself in the easy shorthand of people who share a history. I watched them together across the kitchen, not wanting to but unable to stop myself, and noticed things I couldn't unfeel. The way Jensen clapped Cade on the shoulder and left his hand there for an extra half-second. The way Cade actually smiled, the full version, not the understated, contained one he usually wore, when Jensen said something that made him laugh. The easy familiarity of their body language, the way they stood close together without the careful calibration of distance that Cade usually maintained with most people. I ate my dinner, I participated in conversations, I was pleasant. Inside, something that felt unpleasantly like jealousy was doing what jealousy does, making things look worse than they probably were, reading meaning into everything, manufacturing a narrative. Later that evening, when most of the guests had gone home and the house was quieting, I was on the porch with a glass of water, watching the darkness settle over the ranch, and Cade came out and stood nearby. "Good night," he said. "Yeah," I said, "nice people." A pause. "Jensen said you've been writing well. He saw you in the arena Wednesday." "Oh," I said, "yeah, I didn't know anyone was watching." "He asked who was teaching you," Cade said. There was something in his voice that was very carefully level. "What did you say?" "I said I was," he said, and then after a beat, he seemed surprised. "Why?" He looked at me steadily. "Jensen thinks I'm particular about who I teach." "Are you?" A silence. The night air moved between us, cool and carrying the smell of sage and something sweeter that I couldn't name. He was close enough that I could see his expression in the low light from the kitchen window, thoughtful, a little guarded, with something underneath that I was beginning to learn how to read but still didn't fully trust myself to interpret. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I am." He went back inside. I stood on the porch for a long time after that, holding my glass of water and thinking about absolutely nothing except the sound of his voice saying those 4 words. July deepened, the heat increased. The land moved through its midsummer metabolism, long, brilliant days, dry and electric, with afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the mountains with the compressed energy of something that had been building for a long time. I learned to recognize the signs of approaching weather. The way the light changed quality in the early afternoon, the particular behavior of the horses, the shifts in wind direction that the experienced ranch hands read automatically the way I read text. My writing improved significantly. I was now comfortable enough on river that the physical process of writing no longer required conscious thought. My body had absorbed the basics and was operating from something closer to intuition, leaving my mind free to be present in the experience rather than managing it. There's a quality to riding a horse in open country, when you've reached that threshold of competence, that I can only describe as a kind of moving meditation. The rhythm of the horse beneath you, the wind and the landscape around you, the deep physical engagement of a body working in partnership with another living thing. It strips away whatever mental noise you've been carrying and leaves you in something very close to the present moment. Cade noticed the shift. We were out on the South Ridge one Thursday morning following a new section of fence line when he pulled up Frank alongside river and rode quietly next to me for a while without speaking. Then he said, "You're different on a horse now." "Different how?" I asked. "Easier," he said. "You used to try too hard." "I still try hard." "Trying hard and forcing are different things," he said. "You stopped forcing, that's when horses start to trust you." I looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his profile steady against the sky. "Is that the same with people?" I asked. A moment of silence. Then he looked at me and the look was brief but direct, and I felt it in the center of my chest. "Usually," he said. We kept riding. The bay mare's name, I learned, was Mesa. She was a 3-year-old who had come to the Whitmore Ranch from a breeding operation north of Laramie with the particular combination of intelligence and wariness that makes starting young horses both interesting and challenging. She was not mean. She was not dangerous. She was simply a creature who had very good reasons to be careful about what she trusted, and who needed someone with the patience and skill to earn that trust through accumulated, consistent evidence rather than any single dramatic gesture. I watched Cade work with her every chance I got, which he eventually noticed and, to my relief, seemed not to mind. He would narrate what he was doing when he noticed me watching, not performing for an audience, but sharing information in the economical way of a craftsman explaining their craft to someone who genuinely wants to understand. "She's testing me right now," he said one evening when Mesa was doing her slow, watchful circles in the round pen. "She wants to know if I'll push when she pulls away. I won't. I'll ask and then I'll wait." "How long will you wait?" I asked. "As long as it takes," he said. The horse completed another circle, ears moving, weight shifting. Then, as if making a decision, she stopped and turned to face him. She walked to him. He put his hand out and let her come to the touch on her own terms. The evening light was warm on the pen, on the horse, on him, and I was sitting on the top rail of the fence watching this, and feeling something so complicated and so large that I simply let myself feel it without trying to categorize it. You know what I've been thinking about, I said, when she had moved away again and the moment had settled. What? He said without looking up from the horse. The thing you said about trust taking longer than curiosity, I've been thinking about that a lot. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, What have you been thinking? That it applies to most things, I said. Most important things anyway, the ones that are worth trusting take longer because they're not trying to sell you something. A pause, he was very still. Yeah, he said, that's right. He turned and looked at me then, and I met his eyes, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. The light in the pen was golden and fatting, and the horse was moving in a slow circle in the background, and his expression was the most open I had ever seen it, not quite readable but less guarded than usual, with something in it that asked a question it wasn't quite ready to ask in words. I looked away first. I don't know if that was the right choice, I think maybe it wasn't. The shift happened the second week of July, and it happened because of a thunderstorm. We'd ridden out to the northeast quadrant in the late morning to check a section of creek that the land documentation required me to assess, and the weather had turned faster than either of us anticipated. The afternoon storms usually announced themselves clearly enough for us to track them, but this one had come from the north, moving with the speed and intention of something that had decided not to wait. By the time we turned back, the sky was the particular color of a bruise at the horizon, and the wind had shifted in the direction that meant business. We won't make the barn, Cade said, reading the sky with the calm, practical attention of someone who has been watching Wyoming weather for 24 years. What do we do? I asked. Old Line Shack, he said, quarter-mile east, come on. We moved at a canter through the rising wind, the grass flattening in the gusts, the horses aware of the storm in their particular animal way, alert, quick, working hard without being asked. The first drops hit just as we reached the shack, a small, weathered wooden structure used by ranch hands working far out in the pastures, stocked with basic supplies for exactly this kind of situation. We got the horses into the small lean-to shelter on the side of the shack, and tied them there while the rain came in hard and fast, big heavy drops that turned almost immediately into the kind of sustained downpour that makes the world beyond 15 feet essentially invisible. Cade got the door of the shack open, it stuck, and he shouldered it with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, and we were inside, breathing hard rain damp, while the storm announced itself fully. The shack was small, maybe 12 by 14 feet. There was a wooden bench along one wall, a small iron stove in the corner, a shelf with a few cans of food and some matches and a lantern, and a single small window that the rain was hitting so hard it sounded like static. Cade lit the lantern while I stood just inside the door and tried to catch my breath, and the lantern's warm light transformed the small space from a wet, weathered box to something that was, frankly, almost beautiful, all warm gold and shadow, the sound of the storm making the inside feel safer and smaller than it actually was. Cade sat down on the bench. I sat on the other end of it. The space between us was maybe 2 feet. We were quiet for a while, listening to the storm. The rain was extraordinary, a sound that was almost total, filling everything, the world outside the small window reduced to moving gray shapes and the white flicker of lightning on the horizon. How long do you think? I asked. Hour, he said, maybe less, these move fast. I nodded, another silence. Then, because the hour and the lantern and the storm outside and the closeness of the small space seemed to be operating on me in ways I couldn't quite resist, can I ask you something? He looked at me, yeah. What made you want to work with horses, like specifically this, starting young ones, not competing, not trail guiding, this? He considered it. My grandfather, he said. He was a horsebreaker, old school. I watched him work when I was little and I didn't understand most of it. I was too young, but there was something about watching him with a young horse that I never got out of my head. He paused. He said once that a young horse is a question the world is asking, and the breaker's job is to help it find an answer that doesn't cost too much. I let that sit for a moment. That's beautiful. He was a practical man, Cade said, but he had a way of putting things. Do you miss him? Every day, he said simply. Outside, the storm cracked and rolled, and inside the lantern light was warm and the bench was narrow, and after a while, Cade turned slightly toward me, his arm resting on the wall behind him, and said, with the particular carefulness of someone who has thought about how to phrase something, "Why did you come here?" The internship, I said. I know about the internship, he said. I mean, why did you say yes? I thought about it honestly. My professor told me I had theory without contact. I think she was right. I think I had a lot of ideas about what mattered to me that I'd never actually tested. And now, he asked, Now I think the testing is the important part, I said. The theory is fine, but it doesn't actually change you. Experience changes you. He was watching me with that steady, dark attention that I had by now spent 2 months learning to sustain without flinching. The lantern light was on his face, warm and shifting slightly, and he was close enough that I could see the shadow where his jaw began and the way a strand of damp hair had fallen forward across his forehead. Has it, he asked, changed you? Yeah, I said, significantly. We looked at each other for a moment that went on long enough to become something else, to stop being just a pause between words and start being its own kind of communication. My heart was very loud. The rain was very loud. The space between us felt, suddenly, like it had a physical property, like it was made of something I could feel on my skin. He looked away first this time. He looked at the window, at the gray rush of the rain, and I saw something move through his expression, something that came and went quickly like the weather, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before it relaxed again. Storm's easing, he said, though when I looked at the window it didn't seem like it was. I didn't say that. We waited out the rest of the storm in a silence that had changed quality from the silence before, holding something between us that neither of us named. When the rain stopped and we went out to check the horses and ride back, the world was washed clean and brilliant, every blade of grass catching light, the sky a startling blue. We rode back side by side and didn't speak much, but the silence was different now. It had weight, a specific gravity, and I felt it in my chest all the way back to the barn and through dinner and into the night. I wrote in my field notebook that evening, but not about grasses or creek levels or water table indicators. I wrote about being in a line shack during a thunderstorm. I wrote 3 full pages in the careful, precise language of someone trying to work something out through the act of writing. And then I read what I'd written, and knew that whatever was happening to me was no longer something I could manage with careful behavior and strategic distance. I was in over my head. I had been in over my head for weeks. The question was what to do about it. The answer at first was nothing. Continue as before. Keep the lessons, keep the easy companionship, keep the careful calibration of how close was close enough. Hope that the summer would end and the distance of returning to Philadelphia would give me the perspective to understand what had happened here without it having to happen out loud. That lasted about a week. What disrupted it was Jensen Halvorsen again. He came to the Whitmore Ranch on a Wednesday morning to look at one of the horses. He was interested in purchasing a young gelding that Cade had been starting, and Margaret had arranged the visit. I was doing fence documentation near the barn and had a clear sightline to the round pen where Cade was putting the gelding through his paces for Jensen's inspection. I was not trying to watch them. I was working. But the pen was visible from where I was working and I had no particular reason to look away, and what I saw over the next hour was Jensen Halvorsen watching Cade work with the comfortable, proprietary appreciation of someone who admires what they see and feels entirely entitled to that admiration. Cade moving through the pen with his particular quality of complete, absorbed focus. The two of them talking afterward, Jensen leaning on the fence, Cade standing inside it, both of them animated in a way that told a clear story about ease and history and the particular warmth of old friendship. And then Jensen said something that made Cade laugh, the full version, the one I'd seen before and wasn't sure I'd seen again, and put his hand on Cade's arm just briefly, just a second, and Cade didn't move away from it. I looked back at my fence line. I made notes in my field notebook that were so precise and so detailed that they were essentially the notes of someone who was very carefully not feeling something. That evening at dinner, Jensen stayed for the meal and the conversation was lively and warm, and I was entirely pleasant and participated meaningfully. And underneath all of that I was experiencing something I would be tempted to call irrational, except that feelings aren't irrational, they're just disproportionate sometimes, larger than their occasion, requiring more space than is practical. After dinner, on the porch, I found myself next to Roy, who was smoking a pipe in the companionable, uncommunicative way he had, and I said, not planning to, "How long have Cade and Jensen known each other?" Roy looked at me with the sideways attention of someone who notices more than he says. "Since they were kids," he said. "Jensen always had a thing for Cade's horses, maybe other things too." He said this in the tone of someone stating a neutral fact without emphasis or implication. I said yeah, in a voice that I hoped sounded as neutral as his. I went to bed early that night and lay in the dark listening to the Wyoming night, which was not actually silent. It was full of insect sounds and wind and the distant, occasional sound of horses moving in the pasture, and had a very honest conversation with myself that involved acknowledging several things I had been avoiding acknowledging. That I was completely, thoroughly in love with Cade Whitmore. That I had been in love with him in the quietly growing way that takes root before you notice it, since at least the morning of the thunderstorm in the line shack and probably before. That I had no idea what, if anything, he felt in return, and that the uncertainty was, by this point, one of the more difficult things I had ever experienced. That doing nothing about this for the remainder of the summer would be genuinely unsustainable. That doing something about it without knowing how it would land was terrifying in a way that made fence documentation and grass identification feel like a comfortable vacation. I lay there for a long time in the dark. The night sounds continued. Wyoming held me in its enormous dark patience, which does not hurry anything and does not protect you from anything either. The change in Cade was subtle, and I almost missed it. Over the next week after Jensen's visit, the quality of his silences shifted slightly. Not coldly, nothing about Cade was ever cold, but with a new quality of attention that I couldn't quite read. He was present in the lessons, present in the work, but there was something that I could only describe as a careful distance, the kind of distance that isn't absence but is more like the deliberate management of proximity. He was choosing how close to stand. I could feel it, the same way you can feel wind without seeing it. I noticed him looking at me sometimes, in the moments he thought I wasn't looking back, a direct, serious look that lasted a beat too long before he turned away. I noticed that when we worked closely together, as we sometimes did in the barn or the pen, the 2-foot space between us had developed a quality of self-consciousness, as though both of us were aware of it in a way we hadn't been before. Something had changed in the line shack, I knew it, and I was increasingly certain in the terrifying, uncertain way of someone who is reading signs they desperately want to trust that something was changing in him too. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday evening at the end of July. We were doing a late lesson. The days were long enough at that latitude that we often rode in the evenings, when the heat of the afternoon had settled and the light was extraordinary, and I was cantering river in figure eights in the arena while Cade stood at the center and watched. I had learned by now to read his watching, to distinguish between the focused, evaluative attention of the teacher and the softer, more difficult to categorize attention that I had been noticing more often in recent weeks. This was the second kind. I finished the figure eights and brought River to a walk, coming around to where Cade was standing. I was flushed and breathing hard from the exertion. Cantering required real physical effort, especially drilling patterns, and I was a young man who had been working on a ranch in Wyoming all summer and was, not to put too fine a point on it, in significantly better physical shape than I had been in May. I pulled River up close, probably closer than necessary, and looked down at Cade from the saddle. He was looking up at me. The evening light was hitting him from the west, warm gold, and his expression had that quality I'd been seeing, more serious, open, asking something in a language just below speech. "That was good," he said, "really good." "Yeah," I said. "You've worked hard this summer," he said, "it shows." "You're a good teacher," I said. A pause, something moved in his face. "You're not easy to teach," he said, "most people are easier." "Is that a complaint?" I asked. "No," he said, "it's not." We looked at each other. River moved a foot beneath me, adjusting his weight, and I moved with him automatically, that automatic body-level partnership that I'd developed over 2 months. And then I did something that I had not planned, that arrived from somewhere below my conscious decision-making. I dismounted right there, right next to him, close, and turned, and we were standing about 18 inches apart, and I looked at him at the same eye level and said nothing and waited. He didn't move back, that was the thing. He had 100 ways to create distance and he used none of them. He stood where he was, looking at me, and I could see his jaw working slightly. That subtle tightening that I had learned meant something was happening in him that he was managing very carefully. "Cade," I said, my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Eli," he said, his voice was lower than usual. Not strange, not strained, just lower, with a quality of controlled effort. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this," I said. "I haven't figured it out, so I'm just going to say the true thing and let it land however it lands." His eyes moved over my face. The evening light was golden and still around us, River's warm breath behind me, the distant hills painted in layers of amber and shadow. "Okay," he said. "I think about you constantly," I said. "Not in a way I've ever felt before about anyone, and I don't know what to do with it except tell you, because not telling you it's been very hard, and I understand if—" "Eli," he said. "Yeah." He didn't say anything right away. He looked at me with that direct, steady, undefended gaze, and I felt the moment balance on its edge the way a long pause in music does before the next note comes in, and I held very still, and then he said very quietly, "I started trying to figure out how to do this 3 weeks ago." I took a breath, my chest felt like it had been opened from the inside. What happened to the figuring? "Didn't get anywhere," he said, and the smallest, most careful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, the full version barely but present. "You got there first." What happened next was this. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic in the explosive, rushing way of certain stories. Instead, the two of us standing in the evening light in the arena, River's reins loose in my hand, the ranch settling into its evening sounds around us, the horses in the pasture, the wind in the grass, the far-off call of something wild in the hills. Just that. Just both of us finally on the same side of the thing that had been between us all summer. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," I said. He stopped, started again. "I've been careful for a long time about most things. I'm not somebody who leads with what I feel." "I know," I said. "I noticed you," he said, "the first morning when you were watching me with Mesa." He paused. I told myself it was nothing. "When did you stop telling yourself that?" I asked. "The line shack," he said. My heart did something very large. "Me too," I said. He looked at River, then back at me. His hand moved just slightly, just enough, and found mine where I was holding the reins, his fingers settling over mine with a warmth that was quieter and more significant than anything that could have been said about it. Not demanding, not rushing, just there, present, certain. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It wasn't a confession of fear. It was a straightforward statement of where he was. "Neither do I said, "Not really." "That seems like where we start then," he said. The light finished its change, going warm and low, and River shifted again beneath my loosened grip, patient as ever. And I thought of all the things Cade had taught me about patience, about asking and waiting, about trust being different from curiosity, about the horse being a question the world is asking, and felt, for the first time in months, completely exactly where I was supposed to be. The rest of July and all of August was a different kind of summer. Let me be clear, we were careful. Not secretive exactly, but thoughtful. This was a working ranch, a family operation, a place with its own culture and rhythms, and neither of us was interested in performing anything for anyone. We were building something, and building is slow, and the things that are built slowly are the things that last. What changed was everything subtle. The quality of the silences, which were now comfortable in a new and specific way. The way he watched me ride, still evaluative, still the teacher, but with a layer underneath that was something else entirely, warm and particular. The conversations that stretched longer than they used to, moving easily from horses to land to family history to the future, into the kind of territory you only navigate with someone you trust fully. The evenings when the work was done and the ranch was quiet, and we would sit together on the fence of the round pen or walk out into the south pasture to check on the horses and just be together, in the unhurried way that the wide Wyoming dark seemed to ask of people. He told me about his parents, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small pieces over many evenings, the accident, the years after, growing up on the ranch with Margaret, the particular kind of grief that becomes part of your architecture rather than just part of your experience. He told it the way he told everything, steadily, without performance, trusting that I would receive it properly. I did. I told him about Philadelphia, about the college years and the avoided questions and the compartmentalization I had been so good at, and about what it meant to be here in this landscape doing this work, having become someone I hadn't known I could be. "You were always that person," he said, "you just hadn't been somewhere that needed it." "Does Wyoming need it?" I said. "I need it," he said simply. That was the kind of thing he said sometimes, quietly and completely, without fanfare, statements so true and so direct that they struck me like a physical force and then settled in me like something that would always be there. In the middle of August, something happened that I hadn't expected. Jensen Havorson came back to the ranch to complete the purchase of the young gelding, and this time he stayed for 2 days. There was some additional training transfer that Cade needed to walk him through, some documentation for the horse's record that had to be finalized. It was ordinary ranch business, and I knew that, and I told myself I was comfortable. I was not entirely comfortable. The first day was fine. I was busy with field work, Jensen was busy with horses, we crossed paths at meals and were perfectly friendly. But on the evening of the first day I came back from the north pasture and found Cade and Jensen at the fence of the arena, watching the gelding move free in the late light, and there was something in the configuration, in the ease and closeness, in Jensen's hand gesturing expressively near Cade's shoulder, that landed on me the wrong way. I went to my room. I told myself I was tired. At dinner, Cade glanced at me a few times with an attention that asked a question. I answered it with a small, neutral smile that said everything was fine. He held my gaze for one extra beat that said, clearly, he didn't quite believe me. After dinner, Jensen and Roy and Tomas ended up in the kitchen with cards and some of the whiskey that Margaret kept in the cabinet for visitors, and Cade came and found me on the porch. We stood in the dark, the night enormous and star-filled around us, and after a moment he said, not accusing, just observing, "You're in your head." "I'm fine," I said. "You're allowed to not be fine," he said. I looked at the stars. "I know you and Jensen have history," I said. "I know that, and I know it's not my business and I'm not asking for anything." "Eli," he said. I stopped. "Jensen is my friend," he said. "He has been since we were 10, that's what it is." "I know," I said. "Do you?" he said quietly, not with impatience, with the particular focus of someone who wants to be sure they are being understood. I looked at him. In the dark, his expression was very serious and very open, and looking at him looking at me, I understood that the fear underneath the jealousy was not really about Jensen at all. It was about being new to this, new to being fully known by someone, new to the particular vulnerability of caring deeply about something you could lose. It was the fear of someone who had spent a long time protecting themselves from precisely this kind of exposure. "I'm scared sometimes," I said. "That's what this is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Me too," with the same directness he brought to everything, and the honesty of it hit me straight in the chest. "You're scared," I said. "You're leaving in 2 weeks," he said. "I'd be stupid not to be scared." The words landed and spread out, and I looked at him in the dark and thought, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. I had been so absorbed in the present tense of this summer that I had been careful not to think about the end of it, and suddenly it was 2 weeks away and the fear of it was entirely real. "What happens then?" I said. "I don't know," he said, "but I know what I want." "Tell me," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, "I want you to come back." Simple, direct, entirely without performance. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. "Yes," I said, "I'll come back." The stars were very bright and the night was very large, and he reached out and took my hand in the dark, and we stood there for a long time not needing to say anything else. The last 2 weeks had a quality of both fullness and grief. The way last things always do, you are in them completely and already mourning them at the same time. Every lesson felt significant, every meal at the long table, every morning watching the sun come up over the ridge and light the ranch yard in that particular way, the horses moving in the pasture, the smell of coffee and hay, and the wide, clean air. I finished my documentation work and wrote a comprehensive report that Dr. Alcott would later tell me was the best field report she had received from an undergraduate intern in years. The grassland restoration sections were thorough and precise, the water management analysis careful and well supported. The work was genuinely good, but the work was also honestly secondary to what I was taking away from this summer, and I think even Dr. Alcott knew that. Mesa, the bay mare, the 3-year-old who had been learning to trust since before I arrived, was fully started under saddle by the second week of August. She carried a rider quietly, moved willingly in all 3 gates, loaded into a trailer with barely a hesitation. She was ready. Cade watched her go through her paces on a quiet Tuesday morning with the expression of someone who has spent months invested in a question and has finally arrived at a satisfying answer. "She's ready," I said. "Almost," he said. "She's ready for the next person to keep building it." "Who?" "The woman who bought her. She's patient. She'll do right by this horse." I watched Mesa circle the pen, easy now, fluid, no longer the coiled, watchful creature of the early mornings. "You're proud of her," I said. "I'm proud of the work," he said. "The horse always had it in her, just needed someone to create the conditions." I looked at him, he looked at me. We both knew we weren't only talking about the horse. The evening before I left, Margaret made a proper dinner, not a special occasion announced in advance, just a meal that was somewhat better than usual with the good plates and the good wine she kept for occasions. She thanked me formally and warmly for my summer's work, said Dr. Alcott had written her a kind note, told me there was an open invitation to return. Roy and Tomas both shook my hand with the particular warmth of men who express affection through handshakes, and I felt the genuine gratitude of having been accepted into something I came to as an outsider and was leaving as not quite family, but something close to that, something earned. Cade and I walked out to the south pasture after dinner, in the late light that was still warm this far into August, the golden end-of-summer quality in everything. River was in the far corner of the pasture, grazing in his unhurried way, and we walked out to him and I stood with my hand on his neck while the light went through its changes. I learned more this summer than in 4 years of school, I said. That's what happens when theory meets the real thing, he said. You're going to be insufferable about this for years, I said. He smiled, the full version. It still did what it always did. River's going to miss you, he said. Just River, I said. He looked at me steadily. No, he said, not just River. I turned to face him. The distance between us was the same as it always was, that 2 feet of space that we had been so careful about all summer, and I looked at him, at the person who had in the space of one summer become the most significant person in my adult life, and said, with all the care and honesty I had been learning from him all season, thank you for all of it. He reached out and took my face in his hands, both hands, steady and warm, with the same gentleness he brought to everything he touched, and looked at me for a long moment, and the look contained everything that the whole summer had been building toward. All the early mornings and the thunderstorm and the line shack in the evenings and the silences and the fence and the horses and the two of them here now, at the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. The world went quiet around the edges, the golden light held, River moved somewhere behind me, patient as always. Whatever happened next, between one breath and the next, was ours, and it was the end of the story of the summer and the first sentence of something I was certain would take the rest of a life to tell. I drove to Casper the next morning with Dale, who said approximately 35 words, which was 5 fewer than the first time, and I sat in the passenger seat and watched Wyoming go past the window the same way I had on the way in, enormous, unhurried, indifferent to human scale. But I was a different person than the one who had made this drive in May. I could feel the difference not just intellectually but physically, in the way I sat in the seat and breathed, in the particular quality of the silence I was comfortable with. My phone had a message from him when I turned the airplane mode off on the tarmac in Casper. 3 sentences. Safe flight. The grass documentation you did for the north section is the best field record we've had. Come back. I read it 3 times, then I wrote back, I'll come back. On the plane, I watched the mountains flatten and the plains unfold below me, and I thought about a young horse in a round pen learning that the world could be navigated with trust. And about a man at a fence learning how to ask for something he'd been careful not to want. I thought about all the things this summer had cost me, the comfortable armor of not knowing myself, the easy distance of a life lived in theory, and all the things it had given me in return. I thought about the sound of his voice in a lantern-lit shack with rain on the roof. I thought about a hand covering mine on a leather rein. I thought about the line between knowing and trusting, and how you cross it not once but repeatedly in small brave increments every single day. I thought, this is what it is to be changed. By September I was back in Philadelphia, in my apartment that suddenly seemed very small, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the city that now felt both known and strange. I called Dr. Alcott and gave her a verbal summary of the summer's work. I started my senior year. I sat in classes and took notes and participated in discussions and did, by all external measures, exactly what I had come home to do. And I talked to Cade. Not every day at first, his schedule didn't allow it and neither did mine, and we were both people who preferred presence to performance, who wouldn't fake the ease of daily contact if the ease wasn't actually there, but regularly, steadily. The calls were usually late evening when the ranch work was done and my classes were finished, and they had the quality of conversations between people who have established deep trust, able to go directly to the real, without the scaffolding of small talk, able to sit in companionable silence even over a phone line in a way that most people don't manage in person. He told me about Mesa. She had gone to her new owner, a woman named Claire who lived outside Cheyenne and had settled in well, was being worked regularly, was progressing, was the horse Cade had known she could be. He told me about the new young horses coming in for the fall season, about a section of the east pasture that Margaret was considering for the native grass restoration project I had documented. He told me once late on a Thursday call about a dream he'd had that involved the south pasture at sunrise and River moving through the long grass without a rider, free and easy, and the way the dream had felt, not sad, just wide. I told him about the city and the classes and the particular daily low-grade overstimulation of Philadelphia that I hadn't fully noticed until I knew what the alternative felt like. I told him about the papers I was writing, the professor who had invited me to co-author a piece on native grassland restoration methodology based on my summer fieldwork. I told him about the long runs I was taking along the Schuylkill River in the evenings, needing the movement, needing the outdoor air, needing something that would give me back a fraction of the bigness I had found in Wyoming. "You're homesick," he said one October evening. "For Wyoming," I said. A pause. "For whatever Wyoming gave you," he said. "I thought about that. I think the two things are connected," I said. "Yeah," he said. "Cade," I said. "Yeah. I meant what I said. I'll come back." "I know," he said. "Winter break," I said, "if the invitation still stands." A silence that was not uncertain. That was the silence of someone deciding how fully to say the thing they mean. "It stands," he said. "It'll always stand." I flew back to Wyoming on December 23rd. The landscape was entirely different, covered in a thin early snow, the hills pale and sharp against a sky of absolute winter blue, the ranch yard crunchy and cold underfoot when Dale picked me up in Casper, 32 words this time, a new record. The house smelled of wood smoke and the good dinner Margaret was making, and the table was set with a few extra places because Roy's adult daughter and son-in-law were visiting for the holidays. Cade was in the barn when I arrived. Of course he was. I left my bags inside the door and walked across the yard in the cold, my breath visible, my heart doing what it had been doing for the entire 4-month wait. The barn was warm with animal heat, the smell of hay and horses immediately recognizable as something I associated now with the best things I knew. He was in the far stall checking a horse's hoof. He hadn't heard me come in. I stood at the stall door and watched him for a moment the way I had watched him that very first morning in the pre-dawn dark. He was the same. Exactly the same, the competent, contained, present quality of him, the careful attention he brought to whatever he was doing. And yet entirely not the same, because he was no longer a stranger, was no longer the mystery of the first morning, but the full-weight reality of someone I knew in the way you only know someone after months of honest attention to who they actually are. He sensed me. He always sensed things before he heard or saw them, and looked up, and the look on his face when he saw me was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen from him. Just purely, simply glad. "You made it," he said. "Told you I would," I said. He set the horse's hoof down gently, straightened up, and came to the stall door. He was an arm's length away, and I could see the cold of the yard still on his cheeks and the particular warmth of his eyes in the barn light. "How was the flight?" he said. "Long," I said. "Worth it." He looked at me the way he looked at the horizon when he was reading weather, steadily, completely reading something. Then he reached out and put one hand on the back of my neck, gently, the way he touched things that mattered to him, and pulled me toward him. And we stood together in the warm barn with the horses quiet around us and the Wyoming winter settling outside and everything that had been building since May finally completely still, like a horse that has learned to trust and is no longer circling. I'm writing this story now from my apartment in Philadelphia in the spring of my last semester of college, and next fall I have been offered a research position at a conservation organization based in Laramie, Wyoming. I have accepted. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know in May, which is this. The things that change you most are rarely the things you planned. They're the things you agreed to without fully knowing what you were agreeing to, the internship you took because a professor told you to, the early morning you didn't sleep in, the stranger at the fence of a round pen in the pre-dawn dark who taught you, slowly and with complete seriousness, that trust is not a single moment but a practice. That you earn it in small increments by showing up consistently, by asking and then waiting, by being the kind of person who can be read and still be trusted. I didn't go to Wyoming to fall in love. I went to learn about grass. I learned about grass. I learned about horses. I learned about land and water and the slow, essential work of restoring something that has been depleted. And I learned that the most important things in a life, the things that actually change the architecture of who you are, come at you sideways, in a line shack during a thunderstorm, over a long fence in the golden evening, in the particular silence between two people who have stopped pretending not to know the truth. There's a line Cade said that first morning that I have carried with me since: trust takes longer. He was talking about a horse. He was right about everything. This summer I'm going back, not for the internship. That chapter is finished and its work is done. I'm going back because the Whitmore Ranch is where something in me came alive that is not willing to go dormant again, and because there is a man there who looks at me like I am worth the long patience of trust, and because Wyoming at summer dawn is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen, and because River is 8 years old and apparently still available to be ridden, and because sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the place you go to find yourself turns out to also be the place you go to find someone else. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, a horse breaker looks at you in the early morning light and says something that sounds like a simple promise and turns out to be a map of your entire future. You'll ride like a stallion by the end of summer. He was right about everything.
If this story found you at the right moment, if it settled something in you or made something that was quiet in you a little less quiet, then you already know why I keep writing these. Hit the like button if this is the kind of story you want more. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more interesting LGBTQ stories. The thing he's never quite found the words for. Thanks for watching and keep watching.